Hello all and welcome back to the channel. So in today's video, we are going to talk about root growth. Now, the video is not necessarily orchid specific, but most of my years of growing have been done with orchids. So I feel that much of what I'm about to say is going to be with regard to orchids, though I find most of the houseplants that I do have in my collection will fall under these rules from my learning experience. Now, since I moved here, I have moved my entire collection into what I call a double cup method. So there's one cup that I've put holes into that is placed into another cup that does not have holes. And this has helped me keep my moisture retention and just retain lots of humidity around the roots. And the roots, from what I can see, seem to be exploding again. Mainly the Phalaenopsis that I have in my collection. The Paphs are growing roots, but they are slow growers, so I don't have a lot to show, but I do have some to show before the setback of my move. So I will put a couple of pictures up. But the key to this root growth has been the increased humidity with, of course, the method of growing that I've just shown, the increased temperature, and with the increased temperature, essentially the increased watering, which will be around the base of the plant since we do water the pot and the base of the plant is by the pot. Now, in general, not to get too specific, but roots are needed to uptake the water and the nutrients and also to support the plant structures. So normally, the more plant structures there are, the more roots there are required. Now, one thing to consider utmost about root growth and promoting root growth and healthy roots is your season. Now, the season is the main factor to consider. And when I say season, I don't necessarily mean the physical change of seasons outside, unless, of course, you grow outdoors. I believe most of us do grow our plants indoors, so we're pretty independent of the seasons outdoors. So with that said, the season that I'm talking about is the quote-unquote growing season or warm season. During our warmer seasons, we have the plants experience what we call vegetative growth, where the foliage grows, which will demand root growth because, again, the foliage or structures of the plant, as they increase in number, will demand more roots as they'll demand more water, more nutrients, as well as more support, especially when we talk about our orchids, especially our phals that are epiphytic and our terrestrial and lithophytic paphiopedilums, which all require their roots for support with the medium that we grow them in. Now, when I say warm, I do mean more or less a temperate environment. So in our homes, we grow about 65 to 75 degrees Fahrenheit, which I believe is maybe 18 to 23 degrees Celsius. And warmer temperatures would be indicative of ranges of 76 to 85 degrees Fahrenheit or 24 to 29 degrees Celsius. And anything above that would basically be considered hot. And when we get into these ranges where we're talking about vegetative growth and that being the leaves, the foliage, which in turn will give you more roots. And again, me specifically, I am very independent of the seasons because I under under lights. I also have humidifiers to control my humidity. And I'll also make it a fact to mention that growing under lights and under, more of an intermediate warm environment, the plants are prone to do more work. Normally, our orchids or plants that have a rest or are known to have a dormant season where they slow down have this season because the temperature drops. So because I don't really harbor a cool or cold environment, my lights never go below 12 hours, which is basically the minimum during my winter time and cooler times. And in the summer, I do bump it up to 14. And maybe now that I'm in Vegas, maybe 16 hours, since my summertime is a bit longer and pronounced. So the plants will be doing more work essentially. So why not just give them more light, the extra water, the extra nutrients to go ahead and do that. Now, in the next portion of this video, I'm going to get into a couple of specific techniques or specific experience points, hot topics that I've learned to go ahead and promote root growth during this season. So number one, point A, is going to be a tight pot. Now, I don't mean that you want to overcrowd or squeeze your plant into the smallest pot you can find, but a plant should be basically root bound until it can't fit in that pot anymore, which most of the time you'll notice by the increased watering. So as you develop your habit of watering and you notice that you're watering a plant a lot more frequently over the span of its growth, one of those reasons can be because it needs an upward pot. However, when the plant is tight, one thing that it does have is security, and what I mean by that is support. And I noticed that with my phals and with my paphs and a lot of my plants, when the roots have a good support system, a nice root ball, and the plant is nice and sturdy, it promotes good root growth. They cling to the media, they swirl around the pot, and this to me is indicative of having good media, a good air circulation with the drying of the pot. Yes, as your pot dries, this does create air circulation. That movement does create air for the roots. And moving on to that, the next point, number 2, point B, is going to be allow a dry time. So you have to get to know your plant and get to know your dry limits. Drier medium will cause root tips to search for water, as they do in nature. So you can sort of imitate that in your pot. Again, you have to know your plant. For example, my paphs, I water them as they approach dryness, but my phals, I do allow to go bone dry. And I do this because it promotes healthy root growth in the pot. You can't overwater because you'll deal with things like root rot, and you can't underwater because the roots will just dry and die. So moving along, number 3, point C, is actually going to be lights. So one thing I did notice is that roots like to go to the dark, dampest place that they can, which is mainly the pot. But sometimes, especially in the case of Phalaenopsis with aerial roots, they will grow outside the pot. And one way to direct them is to, face them either away or toward light. It seems that roots will grow away from the light, and I cannot remember, I think there's a YouTuber named Nicole Deanna that supported this, because I was thinking about this when I believe I had a cattleya that was growing, and she had mentioned that it would make sense that the roots would grow away from the light because that's where the tree would be, essentially. So the tree would be where the darkness or the shade would be, and the sun would be basically essentially where the air is, where the sun is shining through the canopies and onto the floors and, through the leaves of the forest. And I just thought that it was an instant click in my head. So because our orchids that I'm, mainly talking about or are epiphytic, or at least more epiphytic than not, it seems like the lack of light equals a tree in that direction, or some sort of clinging structure that is essentially blocking the light. Let's see here. So the next one, point D, number four, letter D, is water quality, or the parts per million. So I'm not going to delve too far into this, but when I was in DC, I had what I would consider was a decent ppm, or parts per million. So there's a ppm meter that you can purchase. I have one that came with my zero filter to test the amount of material in your water per million. And when I was in DC prior to my move here, the parts per million were about 150 to 175, and I didn't have a buildup in my pots, and I was also able to water free of having to use any type of filter. However, my move here, I now have a ppm of about 400, 450, which leads me to believe that anything above 200, from what I've heard, I've never experienced in between, but anything above 200 seems to need more flushing. But it also means that your medium is going to break down faster because you're watering it more, essentially, with these flushes. And just in general, like, if you can water once a week, that is great. That is what I strive for. When I was in DC, I watered once a week during the summertime, and I watered every 2 weeks during the cooler winter seasons when I didn't need to water much and there wasn't that much light, which I learned you could change and manipulate under grow lights. And lastly, the last point I'm going to hit, because a lot of people just think you can do this willy-nilly, and I'm not a big fan of it, but repotting. Repotting will promote roots for that medium, but you should only do repotting, definitely in the season or when it's needed, not just because, you bought a new plant. I don't know, I'm just not for repotting immediately or because I want to. I prefer the repot when the plant needs to. If the plant is in a certain medium and living that way and I bring it into my environment, I'm going to leave it that way and figure out maybe how to water it for a couple of months before repotting or until that season. If I do buy it in the growing season, maybe I will repot it after I buy it, but it has to be in the growing season. There has to be a necessity. And with that, I'll leave you all with the 5 points that came up with, which are repotting, your water quality, your lights in the direction thereof, allowing a dry time for your pot, and making sure that your roots are secure in the pot. Not necessarily pot bound, but definitely snug in your pot. Thank you all for staying tuned for this video. Please leave me your comments, and if you have anything that we should add to promote root growth for not only orchids, but maybe our houseplants as well, definitely check out my social media page. My handle, like on YouTube, is The Right Path, and I'll see you all in the next video.